Hello and welcome. Welcome to our discussion, Better Think Twice, Subcultures Alts and the Politics of Transgression. This year with Face Value, we are discussing the role of media in a period of resentment and polarization. And within this context, we aim to pay special attention to the role of speech and language in order to understand how far-right groups, parties and politicians operate, and how, if possible, they can be confronted. Now, the case of the alt-right is an alarming example of how verbal and visual communication, how words, memes, and trolls can be used to fanaticize and also to purposely confuse. The elements of transgression, of nonconformity and subversion have been appropriated by its members to obfuscate their orientation and what basically was and is fascism. So one of the questions that we feel that remain open and we want to address today is how to oppose the situation and which vocabularies, practices and strategies are in a way still available. Wishing to talk about this issue and to specifically comment on the role of the subcultures and of what we could call counterculture, we invited two writers that have worked on this topic to engage in what we informally call an unmoderated conversation. So we are indeed very honored and happy to have with us Florian Cramer and Nagle. Florian Cramer is a media theorist and writer. He's a reader in the 21st Century Visual Culture at Wilhelm de Kooning and Academy and Piet Zwart Institute. His most recent publications include the articles What is the Post-Digital?, the documentation of the lecture Mapping the Alt-Right, that I'm sure that many of you have watched, and Crapularity Hermeneutics in the forthcoming publication Pattern Discrimination, edited by Wendy Chan, Hito Steiger, Clemens Abrich, and Florian. Angela Nagle is a writer. She's the author of the bestseller book Kill All Normies, From 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the Alt-Right. Angela has especially studied the relationship of the subcultures, the countercultures, and the mainstream as it evolved in the online sphere. She's an essayist for The Baffler, The Atlantic, and Jacobin magazine. She's also the co-editor of Ireland Under Austerity from Manchester University Press. Please join me in welcoming Florian and Angel. Thank you.
Yeah, let's start the conversation, and it's uncommon for us as well not to be moderated, right?
Yeah.
And I think we want to start off the conversation with subculture. Mm-hmm. And this is also at the center of your book, Angela. Maybe, Daphne has mentioned it in her statement. We are both sitting here probably because we published on this phenomenon of the alt-right. Maybe we need to revisit it. But you wanted to start off with also referring to an older theory of subculture, right?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words about the way in which subcultures appear in the book. So the book is really about the online culture wars of the last 8 years or so. That's roughly the timeline. So it's actually not strictly about the alt-right in the sense of like white identitarians, white nationalists. It's very much about the online culture wars in general. So it covers, there's a chapter on the manosphere, which is the kind of the anti-feminist kind of internet, I guess, which has a whole range of small subcultures within it. It looks at subcultures on the left and the right, and there's lots of them. Some of the biggest characters that emerge in it would later be called, or well, even at the time they were, but would be called alt-light, which is like a derogatory term made by the alt-right to describe those who they see as a watered-down version of themselves. So this would be Milo Yiannopoulos and people like that. So those kind of characters that were very much emerging at the time as kind of leaders in these kind of youth right-wing subcultures online that were pro-Trump and that were used a lot of the memes and the imagery that came from 4chan. So it's about those kind of more than the alt-right in the very strict sense. How subcultures kind of came into it was really that the book emerged from research that I had been doing on anti-feminism online. And one of the things I noticed about it was first of all, that it had the feeling of a subculture or a set of subcultures. Subcultures had kind of been declared dead, for years beforehand, with the decline of the kind of like, punks and goths and things like that. A lot of music writers talked about how subcultures were dead. So it seemed to me these were kind of emerging online in an interesting way, and they were being. That you would be missing something if you simply saw them as political movements. They were very aesthetic, and they had their own internal language, and they had all of these kind of subcultural traits. But also, one of the most important places that I was looking was really 4chan. I thought that was the most interesting one. There were other places, the Red Pill and different subreddits and things like that. But I thought 4chan was the most interesting because at the time, at the beginning of this period, that was being written about in quite a positive way. My theory is essentially that it was being written about in a positive way because it had many of the features that people who were naturally kind of politically predisposed to like subcultures recognized as progressive. So in other words, they thought this is, anonymous, it's youth-oriented, it's networked, it's bottom-up, it's it's digital, it's subcultural, it's all these things, and it's transgressive and rule-breaking. So therefore, there must be something progressive about it politically. And I had the feeling very early on that this wasn't the case, and that actually something quite dark was more likely to emerge from it, and something that would certainly be on the right politically would emerge after, as time went on. So one of the ways in which I kind of tried to theorize this was using the work that had been done on music subcultures years before. So briefly, the Birmingham School wrote about subcultures in an academic context, and one of their critics, I thought, became very relevant because I felt that Sarah Thornton had this great critique of the writing on subcultures that I felt had a parallel with what I was looking at. So I'll just...
brief interjection for some people who might not be familiar with it. Birmingham School, that is pretty much the founding school of British cultural studies, which in the 1960s, as opposed to continental humanities, very much embraced study of working class culture, pop culture, subculture, etc.
Yeah, and actually there were two kind of main critics that I reference in the book, Angela McRobbie as well, and Sarah Thornton, and both of them had, I guess, a kind of feminist critique of it in some ways, but more importantly for the purposes of what I was writing, they were essentially pointing out the tendency of people to mistake certain kind of aesthetic traits for something progressive politically. So this is just a quote from Sarah Thornton's kind of critique of subcultures, and it comes from an essay called The Social Logic of Subcultural Capital.
And it's from 1995, so it's already more than 20 years old.
Yeah, that's right. And she's essentially referencing Bourdieu and essentially reinterpreting subcultures as a kind of having a more snobbish, almost exclusive aspect to them, or certainly less progressive than they might have been written about. So she writes, vague opposition is certainly how many members of youth subcultures characterize their own activities. However, we can't take youth discourses literally. They're not a transparent window on the world. Many cultural studies have made the mistake of doing this. They've been insufficiently critical of subcultural ideologies. First, because they were diverted by the task of puncturing and contesting dominant ideologies. And second, because their biases have tended to agree with the anti-mass society discourses of the youth subcultures they study. So obviously that was relevant for a book called Kill All Normies. While youth have celebrated underground, the academics have venerated subcultures. Where young people have denounced the commercial, scholars have criticized hegemony. Where one has lamented selling out, the other has theorized incorporation. In this way, the Birmingham tradition has both over-politicized youthful leisure and at the same time ignored the subtle relations of power at play within it. So I won't go on too long, but that is essentially the argument of my book, that there are quite reactionary and quite misanthropic and quite nasty elements that were there for a very long time in this online world, and it came to full fruition in the form of the alt-right.
Maybe the first thing that I would like to do is a complication for the audience right now is we're talking about subcultures, and also if we're talking about 4chan, image boards, the so-called alt-right culture, for example, using memes like Pippa the Frog, which is very familiar territory for people in Anglo-American culture, but I imagine if people who are not new media specialists or internet culture specialists sitting in the audience and maybe coming from a continental or German background might not be familiar with it that much. So to unwrap it a little bit for the local context, you could say we're talking about a subculture or a discourse that is very similar to you could say the radical and extreme right and populist right that we are currently seeing everywhere in Europe. And in Germany, it would be people like the identitarians, for example, the identitarian movement, which just a few meters from here had made several squatting actions on ministries on the Brandenburg gates with their flyers and banners. Or we're talking about someone like Götz Kubitschek, or we're talking about the current debate on Simon Strauss, the son of Boto Strauss. Only what we see in Germany is this is all happening, I would say, in the old media. It's in the old media of the feuilleton, in the old media of street actionism, etc. Whereas what we see in the US is that the same kind of populist discourse has totally migrated into a kind of militant internet culture. Yeah? That's just for grounding it. I hope that we have everyone on the same plane. And now I would like, if you allow me to continue, I would like to disagree with you, and I would like to disagree with Daphne in her opening statement, because she said, and I wrote it up, transgression has been appropriated, and you had the same or a similar characterization with the Birmingham School, where subculture or counterculture was identified as always something progressive. And what I brought here is something from 1985 or 1986, I'm not entirely sure anymore, and that's a zine called Pure, and it was made by a musician and artist, Peter Soto. Maybe I can enlarge it a little bit. Just a sec. Here we go. Peter Soto, by the way, who has also some recognition in contemporary art. So, for example, there has been an article on him recently in Texte zur Kunst, German contemporary art magazine. And again, this is 30 years old. It starts with a quote by Joseph Goebbels, and then the whole zine is mostly about it's about transgression. Actually, it was so transgressive that Peter Soto did jail time for it, because on one issue he used child pornographic images on the cover, and it's about pornography. It's about serial killers. Which was a whole subculture, was very much linked also to industrial music and noise music culture in the 1980s. Peter Soto was a member of the band White House, that might ring a few bells. And then if you just read the opening paragraph, then you say, we're constantly bombarded with humanist, feminist, and other equally asinine, so idiotic diatribes that writers employ to alleviate the strain on their conscience, etc., etc. If you read this paragraph, for me this reads like 100%. I mean, it could be, you could copy and paste it, just change the, take the 1980 zine aesthetics and turn it into 2010's memes and put it on 4chan and or call it neo-reaction, and it would be contemporary. I could have even more examples. So, for example, this is something I just recently dug out. Sorry, there's another picture that I have. This is also industrial music from the 1980s. The Swastika Commando, produced in Italy, and just like the current so-called alt-right, and that's really a common trait, it plays with transgression in the sense it's provocation, and it's meant for the audience never to, that you're never sure it's serious or is it not. Yeah? Is it ironical Is it just a provocation, or is it serious ideology? And we had the same, for example, also in German subculture of the 1980s. Think, for example, of the band Deutsch-Amerikanische Freundschaft, which very clearly was not neo-fascists, but they had the song Dance the Mussolini, and they had a lot of neo-Nazi fans going to their concerts. Or they even had a song called Militurk, which was covered several times, among others also by neo-Nazi bands, although it was a highly ironical and humorous song, actually, but it could be read both ways. Or Laibach would be another example of a band that also in its beginnings played with a kind of ideological ambiguity. And I would say that in that sense, or I could go even farther back, this was an article in Vice that I found very useful. Charles Manson, who has been this kind of countercultural, transgressive hero for several decades, since the 1960s, since he was arrested for the murder of Sharon Tate in his own family cult, where this article takes apart that he was actually a white suprematist. And white supremacism and racism was one of the major motifs of the Charles Manson family, but it was fully embedded and fully embraced in 1960s counterculture. So even if we take subcultures, counterculture, pop culture of the 60s, 80s, and today, then I would say transgression has been part of it, but also neo-fascist transgression has always been part of it. That would be my slight disagreement. So the only thing maybe, what's the new phenomenon, is that this kind of transgression is now being really weaponized and really ideologically sucked up by the organized alt-right. And if you look, for example, at a blog, at a site like the Daily Stormer, then it also plays with this humor and irony, but is driven from a 100% ideological neo-Nazi agenda. By the way, there has been a really good article, also investigative journalism, on the countercultural backgrounds of Andrew Anglin, the maker of the Daily Stormer. So,
well, yeah. I should say I'm not sure we actually do disagree, because, in a way, I mean, you know, one of the things I kind of try to do in the book is like critique an overly I guess an uncritical kind of view of transgression as something that is inherently of the left, you know, and so if you go and, you know, for example, possibly the oldest example I use in the book is the Marquis de Sade, you know, and Camille Paglia's critique of the Marquis de Sade as itself a kind of parody of the naivety of Rousseau. So that idea of transgression for its own sake, but also as a kind of as a way of breaking through taboos, taboos that can be just as easily erected by the left as they can by the right. There's also a book I reference a lot called Sex Revolts, which is really interesting book kind of about the way in which transgression in kind of music subcultures and countercultures often was a backlash to the perceived feminization and of culture. So this idea that the kind of the mainstream is this sentimental feminized space, and then this like masculine transgressive unsentimental rule breaking counterculture comes in and smashes it. So there's, you know, it's double-edged kind of.
Yeah. And I think we also have good examples in contemporary art. I mean, the Marquis de Sade is a fantastic example because he was perceived as both, for example, a revolutionary writer, because he was actually supporting the French Revolution, and his literature was revolutionary. But then if you look, for example, at the film adaptation by Paolo Pasolini, the 100 Days of Sodom, or Salo, then he turns it into an allegory of fascism. So this kind of double-edged quality of transgression was also analyzed, by the way, by Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, where they also have a whole chapter on de Sade as actually, you know, the Dialectics of Enlightenment is precisely about that. So the kind of how does a progressive discourse turn into barbarism. So the question is, aren't we busy with a very old, with a very old subject? And maybe it's just that there is a kind of recurring naivete in embracing transgression or subcultures as something that has supposedly one political orientation.
Yes, so instead of people being endlessly surprised,
yes.
we should just say, no, this is its own tradition.
Yeah. I mean, if you now zoom in on the, let's say, the contemporary phenomena and the contemporary popular culture, maybe one thing, we talked about this a little bit, to full disclosure, to leak all the details in the half hour that we had before this talk. In your book and in the lecture that I gave and that Daphne mentioned, we both refer to the alt-right as this kind of network of, you could say, online aggressive trolling and reactionary discourse that has all these different shades and all these kind of different manifestations like manosphere, anti-feminism, traditional neo-Nazis, etc. But a question for ourselves maybe is whether this isn't now outmoded or whether we have to revise what we wrote back then or presented back then, because in the meantime Charlottesville happened, and it seems to me as if, let's say, alt-right as this pitch, as this attempt of branding any kind of, you could say, reactionary transgression online, that's now pretty dead. Or would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think that the alt-right has really come into its own as a political movement. You know, it really is a political movement now. And I think, you know, right up until Charlottesville, I don't know if you got this, but when I spoke to people about the stuff I was writing, because I think the first thing I wrote about this stuff was in the Baffler in 2016. And the response I got constantly was, you just don't understand, this is irony, this is transgression for its own sake, it's a subculture, that's the culture of 4chan, and on and on. And it was really not until Charlottesville that people stopped saying that. Yeah. So it has become political, and also all the various groups within let's say the pro-Trump sort of like transgressive right-wing internet, right? All of those separate groups all hate each other now. So you can't really put them all in together anymore.
Yeah. And it already happened when I gave my own lecture. That was just in the week after Richard Spencer had rallied his supporters, so Richard Spencer being the person who coined the term alternative right and being a white supremacist and white nationalist, and calling himself an identitarian, and he had, shortly after the election of Trump, he rallied his supporters and they gave the Nazi salute, and that was already the first crack in the building. Then that was when you already had people, even white supremacist bloggers, who said we distance ourselves from that because it's an old brand. You know, it's an old brand. That's literally that's what Paul Ramsey, one of the prominent YouTube bloggers, said. So he said you shouldn't use that old brand. And I think that's also the problem with the so-called alt-right at large. It now has become an old brand in a way. That's also the kind of volatility of internet culture, and they have also burned their own brand. If you look at it from a kind of branding perspective. But on the other hand, the phenomenon or the network as such doesn't go away, right? It's still the same people, it's still the same network. And they're now trying new names, like calling themselves in America the New Right. This is also something, or alt-right. These are all different brands. But the question is, I mean, the latest example that I would have is the recent career of Jordan Peterson. I'm not sure whether anyone here is familiar with that. I come from the Netherlands, and where he has just given a very successful lecture tour, and he's turning into this new kind of right-wing, popular intellectual, I would say pseudo-intellectual celebrity. Well, Peterson has been part of this network very obviously. Before the Trump election, he gave YouTube blogs on the metaphysics of Pepe the Frog. He has been together with Gavin McInnes, and by the way, Gavin McInnes, who was one of the editors of Vice, and then turned also into a part of the alt-right that no longer calls itself alt-right today. So Vice would be an interesting example, actually, of a transgressive publication, turning it into a business model and then producing someone like David McInnes at the same time. So I think we still have all these branches, and maybe they distance themselves from the term alt-right, but they're still out there, and it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, there's still... it's still the case that those who are identifying with these newer right-wing, online-based kind of politics, to make the tent as broad as possible, are still trying to, they certainly use the language of and have the spirit of that kind of being a counterculture. Yeah. So for example, Peterson, who would be he would be the softest, I would say, version of this, and the most mainstream, certainly, because he's hugely popular, that he is being seen very much as a counterculture to academia almost, right. And so yeah, they're clearly thinking of themselves in that way, and not thinking of themselves in the way that the establishment right does, which is like a part of a.
But maybe that's the other phenomenon, and this is something where the so-called alt-right has been correct in its self-description. I mean, there's a double-edged strategy in the so-called alt-right. The one is to kind of take over counterculture, subculture, and transgression, but the other one is also to replace the traditional conservative right. And for me, this is a question whether this is actually happening. We see that happening under Trump, among others, that indeed, let's say, the kind of firewalls between traditional conservatism and, you could say, last generation right extremism have more or less burned down. And a really good example would be in the USA, Breitbart. And everything sponsored by the Mercer family. This is also something that we learned in the meantime, that it's basically just all financed by one rich family, billionaire family, which was able to multiply its media power through that. But this is, I'm not sure whether you would agree that this is a larger tendency, that basically what is coming out of this network is currently replacing mainstream conservatism.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I remember hearing a conversation, might have been on a podcast or something, among alt-right people who are saying that any young man who joins the Republican Party in America, for example, now, or who joins, a relatively, just say, right-of-centre party, is kind of being slightly looked at strangely, like, does this person harbour secret alt-right views? Do they have a pseudonym online, and this kind of stuff? And actually, I also hear people say things like, a woman I know said to me recently that she was afraid that her son was becoming alt-right, So it's now literally become like a thing that parents are afraid their teenage boys will do, But so the real question for me is then also, I think it will replace the whole spirit and style and everything of the establishment right, and influence it, no question. But another question for me is sort of like, on the subcultures question, is the conclusion from this that basically there is nothing necessarily, that subculture itself is just a neutral thing, and that it can take on any political form.
And that, I mean, if you go back to this festival and the history of this festival, which I'm not sure whether many people are familiar with it, but it started as a subcultural video festival in the 1980s, and was started by a squatter initiative called Medien Operative, who back in their time got lots of flack for making a satirical montage of a conservative politician committing suicide in a bathtub, which really happened, but they made a kind of meme out of it. So there is a history, there's a subcultural history, let's say, in the DNA of this festival. And then you could ask yourself, well, is that what we're now calling subculture? Does it also have a relation to the kind of media activist culture that sits in the DNA of this festival? And this is where I would like to open another kind of can of worms. If you look at particularly the media activism that has existed since the 1990s, with internet activism, then maybe its most famous manifestation was this, a declaration of the independence of cyberspace by John Parry Barlow, which is not a right-wing manifesto, but it sits very interestingly between the right and the left. John Parry Barlow himself, by the way, was among others an early campaigner for Dick Cheney for the Republican Party, and was a cyber libertarian. Now, you can accuse this festival of a lot of things, but it's certainly not a cyber libertarian festival. You would, I think, in the German context, you would rather have to look, for example, into the Chaos Computer Club as having strong cyber libertarian leanings, or a history in that respect, although also having very critical voices in that respect. But still, a question for me would be whether the online reactionary trolling subculture that we see right now is, let's say, a weaponization or radicalization of cyber libertarianism. And there has been an article here's my other tab, in Quartz just 2 days ago, where Richard Spencer, whom we just mentioned, and now I lost the quote, oh my goodness. Yeah, here it is. No, it's not Richard Spencer, it's another alt-right leader who says, we've almost literally drained the market of libertarians. So let's say the libertarians, the cyber libertarian activists who were online have been sucked into this right-wing reaction as much as has been possible, and the new kind of strategy is to use kind of leftist language like anti-globalization language and anti-capitalist language in the alt-right. Yeah? So again, you can ask yourself, I heard that there has been a lot of anti-capitalist rhetoric here at this festival. I missed the first days, and to which degree this is already right now undergoing appropriation. Open question.
Is it? I mean, the far right has always had an anti-capitalist streak, you know. So that's not that unusual. I mean, it is interesting that I think it's crazy that you could go. Well, no, it's not actually, but it could be seen as quite crazy that you could go from libertarian to like, we want the state to intervene massively to make sure that white women are having more babies and stuff like that. In just a few years, like people went from that to the other. That's actually for me less of a jump in a way than even going from like being a social democrat to being like a pro-state intervention right-winger, you know?
Yeah, but this is, I think, something that you also covered in your book, namely, it's not so much about what I'm for, but what I'm against. So the example would then be, we are against the feminists that want to censor the internet or want to ban our games. It's totally operating on this kind of negative rhetoric, and so the promise that supposedly the extreme right provides more freedom of speech than previously the left. That's very much part of, you could say, the pitch or the marketing strategy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the anti-feminist stuff is really important there because, again, like, you know, the idea that women, that the feminized kind of mainstream culture has been destroyed in some way and needs to be destroyed by this kind of more masculine transgressive counterculture. There is that idea that kind of the institutions have been feminized, and the you know, so you know, you're going to, if you're trying to battle that, you're going to be on the margins in some way. And, you know, Gamergate was obviously very important in all of this because it was about taking back our culture from women who are trying to censor and control and kind of mother almost, and smother these young men.
I wanted to show something on Twitter, but it's taking me too long to log on, so I skip it. But I want to build a bridge to what's currently happening in Germany. There's a single example, which is, I must say, if I may say that, it's also personally, biographically interesting for me, which is about a concrete poet, Eugen Gomringer, who has been one of the founders of concrete poetry, and he wrote a poem many decades ago that had been posted on a college here in Berlin, and it has now been taken down, or will be taken down, because the students found, and I think actually I agree with them. Actually, I actually think it's a bad poem, but that aside, that it is anti-feminist or has voyeurist components, and that they don't feel comfortable with this poem being on the wall. And this has been completely weaponized. If you go to Twitter and you use the hashtag Gomringer, then you see how versions or new variations of that poem are being made, but then by right-wing social media activists. Also Axel Springer Verlag, which has been, let's say, the Murdoch of Germany since many decades, also as a reaction projected the poem on the facade of its own headquarters, corporate headquarters. So that would be an example, again, where kind of it's a mainstream cultural debate on feminism then creates a counter-reaction on, well, this is censorship, and so we go up against the censorship, and that then also becomes politicized. And this is also, yeah, we can really see how the whole notion then of freedom of expression or freedom of speech has been become highly weaponized and highly politicized in the last couple of years.
I think as well Barlow's organization also directly came into conflict with feminists over internet censorship, like an actual legal, disagreement, basically. That a feminist organization, wanted sort of protections against harassment, and they actually, argued against them in it.
Yeah, and that's the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And this is their homepage, and you can ask yourself whether frontier itself is not a quite right-wing metaphor, actually, because it's the idea of homesteading. You're moving the frontier, you're colonizing the continent, and you're moving the frontier for the West. And the same claim was then made for cyberspace. Although, on the other hand, if you read the manifesto by Barlow, it is about inclusion, and it is about minorities, etc. So there has been this kind of schizophrenia. Maybe this has been a kind of schizophrenia or contradictions within these activist movements themselves. And what we see now, that, let's say, where the political pressure is rising and things have to be more concrete, that this is almost like a chemical reaction where the elements separate. Yeah, where you can no longer get away with this kind of mix of left and right-wing politics, but you just you have to choose your color, and that's what's currently happening.
I mean, I guess another question on subcultures in particular then is kind of, I think we agree that there's nothing inherently leftist or progressive or anything like this about subcultures themselves, but the subcultures, certainly in the way we understand them now, are a relatively new phenomenon. They're a reaction to mass culture, basically, the emergence of mass culture. And I find that when I try to make this kind of critical response to subcultures, people who themselves are part of subcultures respond very badly to that, because they feel like you're kind of insulting their thing, and they're often quite hostile to that idea. And there's almost this sense of like, now the right has stolen the left's clothes with all this subcultural stuff, so we have to become, then the left has to become more subcultural. But is it a case of, like, is this just a totally kind of useless idea that we should try to maybe question why it is that we think that there's anything necessarily progressive about being so hostile to whatever the masses are doing.
Yes, and maybe even our discourse here, our discussion is again repeating things that already have been stated. I'm just reminded of the German cultural critic and theoretician Dietrich Dietrichson, who in the 1990s, when there were these firebombings of asylum centers, mostly in East Germany, but also in West Germany, wrote an essay called "The Kids Are Not All Right," because the kids who did these firebombings were people who were, were dressed up as hipsters or as members of subcultures. So again, this is a criticism that has been existing for more than 20 years. Maybe it's the time now to open the discussion. Yes, exactly. 45 minutes. We said in the last 15 minutes we want to pass the mic to the audience. Or is it okay? Yeah? Okay. So we would like to open the discussion, and I'm not sure whether there are microphones in the audience. There are. Yes, I see people. They're on here on the right, and for me, sorry, on your left and on my right. So we're talking already about the confusion of these categories here the whole time, politically as well as geometrically. There are microphones available, and you are welcome and invited to. State reactions, comments, questions, whatever.
All right, I'm holding a microphone here. Shiloh, hi. I have a question that's related to another discussion that's been going on in here at Transmediale about forking. Forking as a specific sort of method of organizing dissent, forking and merging code when it comes to cryptocurrencies. I was wondering if you see specific mechanisms of dissent and merging, as you're talking about sort of the fragmentary ways in which these groups split off and hate each other and work against each other or merge again, and also from a strategical perspective, looking at what kind of strategies you could have to, say, break up certain groups or mobilize different coalitions in reaction to the observation of the mechanics of these kind of online clusters.
Yes, I mean, you could say that the forks are already happening. Yeah, so forking is a notion that very much comes from software development and particularly from open source. So you have a software project. Let's say a good example would be OpenOffice. And then development goes slow, or developers no longer agree, and then you fork off a new project, in that case LibreOffice, and that has different features and moves into a different direction. And so the question is that a strategy that could apply? We could say it's already happening because these groups and subcultures split from each other and have conflicts all the time. But maybe a counter question would be, isn't also that kind of fluidity making it difficult to really take positions? Yeah? And is it also, doesn't this also make opposition or criticism very difficult? For me, for example, a good example, again, I'm trying to always relate it back to the German context in this case. A political blogger that I actually respect quite a lot. He's one of the most famous political bloggers in Germany, Felix von Leitner, Fefe, is a perfect example of someone who crosses the boundaries between the extreme left and the extreme right. Although he identifies clearly as a leftist and even a pro-feminist, he's someone who, for example, very early on gave exposure to Milo Yiannopoulos on his blog, or just yesterday I think had something against Zoe Quinn and feminist game criticism. That is already happening. Maybe we are in the midst of a kind of rearrangement of the whole political field. But this is an open question for me. Are we just being blindfolded, or are we in a trap that, because this is a game that is being played of blurring the lines in order then to buy people into hard ideologies? Or is it really happening that we are seeing like a new kind of constellations where these old categories no longer apply? of, for example, what is mainstream cultural, what is subcultural. If the alt-right says we've memed Donald Trump into the Oval Office, well, where is the subculture and where is the mainstream, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I actually do think, I mean, maybe, it's too soon or it's very difficult to tell, but I do think that it is a total restructuring of how we understand the kind of political compass, if you like. But also, I mean, that kind of splitting is happening everywhere. It's a general trend. Like, you do notice this kind of trying on of political ideologies. If you listen to any people who are in this world, they'll say, well, in 2014 I was a libertarian, and then in 2015 I was a paleo-libertarian, and it just goes on, and it's like, and their Twitter bio will say the identity, the political identity, and that presumably they'll just change it like, every couple of years. And that's more pronounced on the right, but I see it everywhere, actually. Yeah. There's this like, and it's now sort of being satirized by different Twitter accounts who do like, who put three kind of words together, which will be like, libertarian, Maoist, something else, and it is this, trying on of identities. So then the question is, it doesn't seem very serious, and yet we know that it is having an influence.
Yeah. Or we see it in mainstream politics where suddenly, when you were, let's say, the fifth column for Moscow, you used to be a communist, but now you need to be a right-wing populist to be the kind of the person that is for leaving the West and forging close alliances with Russia. So these categories certainly have collapsed. But maybe we should give room for more.
Well, can I just make one more comment before? Yeah, just that. I would also just warn against, my impulse is to be skeptical of anything that suggests that we can, and this is probably not going to be very popular or something like this, but that we can find technological solutions to really old problems. Yeah. Because ultimately these are very deep moral and philosophical questions, and you can't really short-circuit that.
Yeah. Yes, well, can you just go to the mic? We can't see you very well, so just will to power, grab the mic, and...
Okay.
Where is it?
You haven't named any reason. Provoking question. Would you say Obama is left-wing or right-wing? As he said, it's a success that oil prices are falling about 60%. It's a question of lifestyle. And so it's a question of subculture. And so I ask you, is Obama left or right?
If you ask me personally, I would say Obama was a neoliberal politician. Yeah? Sorry, I cannot answer that. I'm not competent. I would say, but let's say, I hope I can approach your question in that way. One of the confusions that we currently have about the categories of the left and the right is that, let's say, the notion of left politics has been, especially in America and especially in Anglo-American countries, a kind of hodgepodge between both neoliberal and up to socialist politics. For example, politicians like Clinton, Blair, or Obama, who then would have been identified as left, although their politics were actually neoliberal. And I think that is also one of the reasons for the success of these right-wing subcultures, is that they take up opposition against neoliberalism.
And that kind of politics is a third way kind of Democrat thing, which is like merging a kind of cultural leftism or a progressivism with neoliberalism.
Hi, Thank you for the very interesting and, of course, very important discussion. I want to push on a place where I think maybe you two will disagree, I think, which is that, Angela, in your book, one of the more sort of controversial claims that you make that's come under a fair amount of criticism is that you place a lot of responsibility for the rise of the alt-right and these new reactionary idioms at the feet of the left, which has, and forgive me if I gloss your book incorrectly because it's been a while since I read it, but that essentially in trading a sort of message of mass liberation for increasingly identity-oriented politics that feel, at least to many people, to be kind of punitive and accusatory, that the left has abandoned some dimension of the political field which has now been adopted or appropriated by right-wing voices. And I wonder, just in hindsight, now that it's several months or a year after the book came out, if you still hold up by that position. And then, Florian, what you think of that? Is the rise of these movements due to the ground that has been ceded by the left, beyond the problems of the Birmingham School and its celebration of subcultures, the more general shift in the left towards questions of identity and questions of a kind of what might be accused of a kind of purist politics?
Well, first of all, yes, I do still kind of stand by that argument. I do still think that. And I mean, the problem is that if you rephrase, what you've just said is a perfect kind of articulation of my argument, but if you rephrase that and say, I've blamed, simply blamed the left for the rise of the alt-right, I mean, that's reducing, I know you're not doing that, but people who've criticized me, I feel have reduced it to a point of complete absurdity. I mean, that's not, why would I argue that? I mean, I would be blaming myself, basically, for, but and the thing is, like, I feel that is a way of, like, emotionally blackmailing you into never making productive criticisms of your own side, which is not useful to anyone. So yeah, I would stand over it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail. This may be indeed a point of disagreement. Why? Well, my first argument, or three arguments actually. My first argument would be we have right-wing populist politics and mass phenomena everywhere in the world, not just in the Western world, but for example also in the Philippines is a really good example of what's currently happening under Duterte, and my friend and colleague Clara Balaguer is doing brilliant research also on the meme culture and visual culture there. In many of those countries, I would even include Germany, where identity politics has not been very strong, or the Netherlands, the populist mass culture has risen without so-called identity politics as its visible enemy. That would be my argument number one. Argument number two is, I would say, well, what was socialism when it fought for the working class? It was identity politics for the working class. What was feminism? It was identity politics for women. What was the American civil rights movement? It was identity politics for the non-white population. So, and I can also, maybe the last footnote, but take it with a grain of salt, because probably you have one of the worst exponents of identity politics here sitting in front of you, because I'm among others politically active in the Dutch party Bijeen, which is, you could say, a party that clearly goes into that direction.
Okay, so on the first one, I would say, of course, the particular things that I was describing don't have to be present for the far right to exist, right? Because it's existed long before any of this. But I do think in the particular context of America, where there is, the militia movement, and there are all these kind of far-right movements, but they're always seen in that Louis Theroux way of, like, marginal, weird, somewhere out in the countryside, unattractive to most people. The question is, why is it that this small far right that already existed. So if you look at, like, you know, a lot of the people like, say, American Renaissance or the people behind NPI, they're a much older group, and they came through the anti-war right and various things. So they were already there. The question is, why was it possible to mobilize masses of teenage boys primarily to kind of propel these tiny groups onto the global stage? And that's where that comes in to me, because they're the ones who were involved in Gamergate and who saw, and all these other things, these speech issues, who saw the identitarian left as punitive and censorious.
Yeah, I would even agree on that. I mean, we would have to unwrap what Gamergate is, I think, for a large audience. We don't have the time, unfortunately. It was a controversy on feminist game critique that exploded. Yeah? Okay. Okay, we can have 20 minutes more. Okay, so to recap, good, thanks. For those who still want to stay, I mean, nobody is forced to stay in the audience. So Gamergate in 2014 was a phenomenon where feminist game critics got viciously attacked on 4chan. You have a very good summary of that in your book, and that really turned into a kind of subculture movement that you could really say was the beginning of the current so-called alt-right trolling culture. And this is, I think, what your book really brilliantly reconstructs. My counter-argument, again, would be, well, this has been a recruitment and marketing strategy of the extreme right, always in different periods under using different strategies. So Richard Spencer, who coined the term alternative right, had been an activist of the extreme right, the traditional extreme right that you mentioned, like Jared Taylor, before, and then he tapped into that potential. If you, for example, go back into the 1980s, if you, for example, look at the National Front in the UK, or also comparable parties, extreme right parties in continental Europe, what they, for example, did, they tapped into the culture of post-punk. Yeah? For example, I showed the White House people, but then if you take skinhead culture in the beginning was not right extremist. It was actually the opposite. It came out of Jamaican ska culture, and then this was really appropriated. When the extreme right saw that there are some reactionary tendencies within the skinhead movement, they both recruited the skinheads and also dressed up as skinheads themselves. A good example was also the German extreme right, people like Michael Kühn, for example. Or if you look at football hooligans, you could say football hooligan culture, when it came up in the 60s, 70s, always had a kind of militant, reactionary, anti-feminist tendency. It was about beating up the other people. It was a celebration of archaic masculinity, etc. And at some point, the extreme right saw this is an ideological potential that we can tap into, and we can recruit these people. We can recruit the football hooligans. Really prominent example in Germany is the party Die Rechte, with what is this guy called Siegfried Borchardt in Dortmund, was the hooligan leader of Borussia Dortmund in the 1970s. So I would say that the extreme right has then used the same strategy that they used with the skinhead and the football hooligans in the 1980s, today, you could say, with the internet hooligans. Only with the difference that the internet hooligans are much better educated than the football hooligans of the 1980s. This is why they're much more powerful, and they're also able to kind of game and weaponize this medium in a much more efficient way than a few football hooligans beating up people in the streets.
Florian,
yeah.
Just want to say that we have extended the time a bit, because I think there is a great attention and tension in the room to ask questions,
Yes.
to make comments.
We have to
please
keep it brief.
Keep your answers
Yeah.
short,
Yes.
because we also
Okay.
have the weaponization of language coming up upstairs. But I'm going to be really sadistic because
rightfully so.
by
Thanks.
actually asking myself a question. Sorry, because I have it burning inside of me. No, but it's like listening to you. I want to go back to your very first. You started out with subcultures. You've been keeping on talking about subcultures. Sometimes you talk about subcultural movements, and I think there's an important difference. Like subculture for me is in itself a cultural studies concept that I never really could identify with. As somebody that grew up, in a Swedish small town where there was very little opportunity to actually enter a subculture, but at the same time being very interested in subcultural expressions and strategies. The internet maybe being the only thing, early internet culture, that allowed me to kind of enter into some kind of subculture. But and this, I think, is really important. How are subcultures actually composed? Are they static entities? You're talking a lot about ambiguity, how fractions form and fork and so on. But that's still within a concept of them as more or less static and then forming new subcultures. And we had Megan Bowler talking about effective politics, for example. When we talk more about movement, and we talk more about how can people get mobilized? How are the subcultural energies today mobilized? That's a question also of power. Who can then legitimize these subcultural sentiments? How can they enter into the political mainstream? I'd like you, if you could address, also Angela, this kind of the movement of subcultural strategies, sentiments within politics and today. I think this would be a very important dimension to explore.
And keep it brief, okay. Angela, that's a difficult one.
There is this years-long argument that goes on, that has gone on in academia, in cultural studies about the subculture's definition, and there's an endless back and forth. David Hesmanhalge is one of the people who's kind of tried to address this, and they ended up coming to some kind of a consensus, which was that they changed the term to scenes. But I think that I think that subculture, it's an imperfect term. It's like any of these things, it's covering something that is, that cannot be perfectly defined, and where you can always find exceptions and so on. But to me, I would say the thing that seems to mark it for me is like a sense of belonging to a culture that has its own slightly hard to enter qualities. So if you're using the same slang, the same language as a particular group of people, if you're wearing the same clothes as them, if you're going to the same venues as them, if you are reading the same things as them, this is a characteristic that you can see, and even, you can have subcultures within subcultures, but you'll find this pattern of behavior that you can mark each other out. You can recognize when someone else is part of your subculture. So that's a little vague, but it's more that kind of belonging, that I think marks it out.
Yeah, and I would say if you go on 4chan and if you don't speak the language, you will be singled out immediately. Yeah. It will take you several months actually to be able to be literate in that subculture.
Yeah, and to not know those things. This is what Sarah Thornton wrote about. To not know those things is the worst thing you can do. It's when you lose the subcultural capital.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we?
Is this hello? Yeah, it's funny because I come from subculture myself in the UK. My brother was a skinhead in the 80s, and to come from a punk background, that's why Furtherfield was kind of formed as well. But the question, and it's funny because it's like having your kinds of past theorized in front back to you. But I think the real question is, recently in the UK around kind of like art culture, and there was the LGN 50 gallery that opened up, and some protesters kind of aggregated many numbers around this gallery and threatened them, and it was closed down. Whether it's for a reason they run out of money or whether they use it tactically just to get their voice out temporarily as an alt-right gallery, or maybe it was an alt-right gallery. There's lots of arguments around all this. But I just wanted to, the question is, which is a lot of what's coming from the right, especially towards feminists, but also around in art culture at the moment, about not allowing a platform for discussion around some of the issues that have been discussed within alt-right culture. And I was wondering what your ideas are around whether what's ethical for the left is ethical for the right in threatening and getting the gallery closed down, indeed, if that's actually what actually happened. And so I was just wondering, so is it right to aggressively attack a gallery and close it down, even though it's, I mean, I'd do it myself, but as far as you're concerned, is it wrong to close down a gallery even though it's right-wing? Or proposing the ideas of being
if I take up this question, then this is really hard not to crack. The thing is of course, in the arts, we have a whole tradition of fascist modernism. That starts with Marinetti, Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, Ernst Jünger. You have it, and you could say what LD50 did. I'm quite familiar with the program. Was you could say an update of fascist modernism. And my own initial reaction with these protests is what I liked about them was actually their blog, which is excellently written, which was an excellent, the first kind of critical analysis, for example, of Nagle, who had been an influential media and cultural theoretician, and who actually had been at the roots of the neo-reaction alt-right exhibitions in LD50. He was personally invited and involved, and let's say my problem with the protest personally was I thought they were kind of hitting the messenger, in the beginning, but when it was linked actually to an analysis, then I think this is fair game. It's also, it's fair game to strike back. I think the gallery was not really forced to shut down. There was just a rally against it. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think it's perfectly legitimate to protest against art. It's also perfectly legitimate for the students, for example, here of the college, to voice critical concerns about a poem. If something is poetry or art, it doesn't mean that it's sacred. I'm against censorship. I appreciate Ezra Pound, I appreciate Ernst Jünger and all these people, and Marinetti. But actually, I see it as a good thing if there's controversy around art. I come from a country where, the Netherlands, where I think there's too much indifference about art. So if there would have been such a gallery or such a poem, then probably nobody would have cared. Or few people would have cared. So I think that's positive. If we have a dispute on art, and as far as I know, the LD50 protests, they were within the range of what is legitimate civic protest. And by the way, I would give the extreme right the same freedom to protest left art in their own way. If it is not in the form, for example, of doxing attacks, or, for example, the kind of attacks that were run by 4chan against artist-run spaces in the US. It's a question of how you do it, I think, not whether you're allowed to do it.
Yeah, I would also add to that even this is not the like principled or the consequentialist argument either. It's sort of just like, a strategic question maybe. One of the things that really did help the alt-right and the online Trumpian right, will say, emerge is that people continued to use these real world or real life strategies. So let's say if you shut down a speaker, there might be only 200 people in the room who, let's say, don't get to see that speaker, but millions of people will see them not getting to speak. So the fact that we live in a time when everything can be immediately put online kind of changes, you know, those strategies, because what you end up with is the spectacle of those people not being allowed to speak. And I think it's been quite disastrous, actually, and it, you know.
But yesterday, I think on a blog there has been an analysis by an anti-fascist aspect of the shutdown protests against Milo Yiannopoulos in Berkeley a year ago. And I think he had quite good arguments to say, in the end, there were the same arguments made, right? Should people protest Milo Yiannopoulos or not? And instead, in the end, it was successful. Because what happened is these protests put Milo Yiannopoulos on the spotlight, gave him more exposure, made him a hero of the entire conservative spectrum in the US. They even invited him to Republican Congress, but then because he got that exposure, conservatives actually looked into his past and found his remarks about pedophilia, which destroyed his career. Yeah, so in the way that can be a good thing also to create more publicity and create a debate. I think one of the reasons why the so-called alt-right was so successful in 2015 and 16 is because they operated under the radar. And one of the reasons why they're now more shattered is because they have been scrutinized. And we know who the people are.
And I definitely also agree that it's not a question of do you shut everything down or do you just react with indifference and ignore them? When people say ignore them, I hate that because that's a terrible. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, why would you be indifferent to something that's like, you know, such a serious political question? So I absolutely agree. There should be, you know, protests in every direction, you know, when it's a very major and important and meaningful question.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask, like, so I'll just stand up. Yeah, isn't it though also that to some extent with populism, you're getting basically ideas that start off in, say, subculture being adopted by like social democrat parties, like the Labour Party. I mean, for example, Paul Mason, who is seen as like a big figure in, you know, the kind of new formation of the kind of like social democratic thing in Britain, is like sharing a platform of, I'm not very good at pronouncing, Alain de Bonist, the kind of godfather of the French New Right, yes, at a previously left-wing foundation, the Feltrinelli Foundation. And you know, it seems to be that actually, I don't know, the state itself or the kind of mainstream, you know, do you think it's wise for them to adopt some elements, you know, this argument that it stops it from entering into the fringes?
Yeah, I think it's exactly because of what we discussed before, that you could say the extreme right or the populist right strategically made use of a lack of critical discussion of neoliberalism. But maybe now the new political fronts are emerging of pro and against neoliberalism, and there you can also have very strange alliances of the left and the right. Yeah, I think we feel a kind of fatigue, and people are leaving. Maybe it's a good time to wrap up. Yeah, since we don't have moderators, thank you.